So JSON is a very popular format for storing and holding data. In a previous video, we've taken a look at reading data from a file, processing the data and writing it back to file. We've used a very primitive format of data, which is CSV. In this video, we'll be taking a look at a JSON format, which is widely used in the software development and engineering world. It's used to store data as well as transport data over the network in web development. We'll be updating our Python application to read data from a JSON file, process it and write it back to a JSON file. And we'll take a look at how to process JSON data. This is the foundation and building blocks for what we'll need to learn for building a web app. So without further ado, let's go. JSON is a popular format for storing data. A JSON object is data within curly braces. Data can have fields with values separated by colons. Fields can contain nested JSON objects. We can also place many JSON objects in what's called a JSON array with square brackets. We can then write this data to a file or to a database or use it to communicate with other applications. So if you take a look at my GitHub repo, I have a Python introduction folder with a README, and this is the fundamental introduction to Python where we take a look at getting a Python dev environment up and running, as well as all the fundamentals of Python. I then, in the Python introduction part 2 section, also have a README, and this is where we go over how to read and write files and deal with files in Python. In this video, we're going to be going through JSON. In the Python introduction part 3 folder, I have another README, and this is the introduction to Python for JSON, where we learn how to read and write data to a JSON file and how to work with JSON data structures in Python. So remember to check out the link down below to the source code so you can follow along. So as in part 1 and 2, we're going to be using Docker for our dev environment. Docker helps to keep our application portable, so we don't need multiple versions of Python installed in our machine, and also makes it easy for us to run our applications in the cloud because container applications are highly portable so they can run anywhere. So we're going to start off this video with starting up our Python dev environment, which I've defined in a Docker file. The Docker file only needs the first 2 lines, which is from Python 3.9, running in a lightweight Alpine Linux container, and we specify that this layer is called dev, and then we also create a work directory. So if we take a look at the Docker file, we have these 2 lines over here, and in this video we're using Docker multi-stage, so the first 2 lines will represent our dev environment, and we'll mount our source code into the work folder inside of the container. Now to get this dev environment up and running, all I'm going to do is change directory to the Python introduction part 3 folder, and then I'm going to go ahead and say docker build --target dev. That is because we want to build the dev target, which is the first 2 lines in the Docker file, and then we say dot because that is where the Docker file is in the current directory, and then we tag it as Python. So I'm just going to tag this container image as Python. So I go ahead and run that, and that'll build up a lightweight Docker container we can use for our dev environment. And to run this environment, it's very easy. I just say docker run -it for interactive terminal, and then I say -v, which is basically mounting in my working directory using the working directory environment variable. So we'll be mounting this working directory into the container on a folder /work, which represents the folder inside of the container. So we'll mount our working directory into the container, and then we say we want to run Python, which is the image we've tagged during our Docker build, followed by sh so that we can get a shell terminal into the container. And when I run this, it'll launch the container, and notice we are inside the container now. So if I do ls, we can see the files on the left here that's mounted into the container. In addition, we can say python --version, and you can see we now have access to the Python programming language inside of this container. So as you can see, we now have access to Python running inside of a container, and we don't need to install it on our machine. Now next up, we'll very quickly create a Python application that demonstrates the fundamentals of Python, as well as read and write files, as well as read and write customer data to files. So we'll very quickly take what we've learned in part 2 and get an application up and running. And currently this application will read and write its data in CSV format. So the aim is to take a look at how to convert this into JSON and learn about dealing with JSON in Python. So to get started with this, the first thing I'm going to do is in my part 3 folder, I'm going to create a new folder called src, which is a source code folder to hold my source code because I'd like to keep it separate from everything else. And then what I'm going to do is in the src folder, I'm going to create a new file called app.py, which is going to be our Python application that deals with customer data. Now in part 1, we learned about the fundamentals of Python, which is classes. So we create a customer class that defines our customer. It also has fields on it, which is customer ID, first name and last name, as well as a function to compute the full name. Another thing we learned is how to write a function. So we created a function called getCustomers, which takes a dictionary of customers and returns it. This function abstracts away the functionality to get customers. These customers could be coming from a database, a cache, or the cloud, or a file. So we learned how to deal with dictionaries. In addition to that, we created a function called getCustomer, which takes in a customer ID and uses the dictionary to get a specific customer and return it back. And to test these functions, we learned how to invoke them by saying getCustomers and then assigning that to our customer dictionary, and then also using the getCustomer function and passing in an ID to get an individual customer and then print them both to the screen. So if we run that, we can see we can print these objects to the screen. So now we have the fundamentals of dealing with objects and functions in our code. In the previous video, we've learned how to read and write our customer data to files. So let's go ahead and update our application to read and write from files. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to replace the contents inside of our getCustomers function with logic to read it from a file. So what we've done is we import the os.path library for Python to deal with files and directories. Then we say os.path.isFile. So if this file exists, then we open it and read it into a dictionary and return it back. If the file does not exist, we return an empty dictionary. We also have to import another library, which is import CSV, which is a built-in library for Python to deal with CSV files. So that'll allow us to read the content from file. But since we don't have a file, we're going to need to create another function called update customers, where we can take a dictionary of customers and write it to file. So we can use this function to create a new file, or we can update our existing file. So we now have the two functions, getCustomers and getCustomer, and below this we're going to create our third function, which is called update customers, which takes in a dictionary. We then specify some fields for the header of our CSV. We use the with clause to open a file for writing capability. We then declare a new CSV writer. We write our header, and then we loop our dictionary and we start writing our customers as rows using the writer object. So this function will allow us to create our file or update it. Now to test these functions, what I'm going to do is remove these other functions that I have, and I'm going to create a new customer dictionary called customers, and I'm going to pass in all my legendary engineer customers into this dictionary, and then I'm going to call our save function by saying update customers and passing in the dictionary. And to see the changes, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to call the getCustomers function to read the CSV file and populate our customers dictionary. And then we can use the famous for loop that we've used before to loop over the dictionary items and print the customers to the screen. And look what happens when I run that. When I say Python source and the path of the script, it goes ahead and writes the customers to the log file, as we can see here, including our heading. So that is the update customers function. And then we also read the customers and print them to the screen. And we can see it successfully read all our customers back to the screen. So that's a quick summary of reading and writing to files using CSV formats. So now we've written our data in CSV format, and the goal of this video is to learn about JSON. Now CSV format is a very primitive way of storing data, and it's structured as rows and columns. Now JSON is a much more dynamic structure and very powerful, because instead of rows and columns we can have fields, and fields can represent properties of our objects, but can also represent nested JSON objects. And JSON also allows for syntax to define arrays or lists of objects. So JSON structure looks more like a tree instead of just a table format. So defining a JSON object is very simple. It generally starts with curly brackets, and then we can expand these brackets and start creating properties. Like in our case, we can have first name, and then we can separate the key and the value by a colon and specify the value. So we have the key and the value. This here makes up a JSON object, and in our case this could be our customer object. If we want to introduce a second field, we have a comma followed by the second field. In our case we could have last name, which is another key and a value. We can also have nested objects. So in this case I could have another field called siblings, and we can have a list of customers by defining the square brackets. Square brackets are arrays in JSON, and then I can continue to expand this, and inside here I can define multiple objects, and these objects can also have their own properties, so we can further expand it like so. So you can see this provides a very powerful and dynamic way to build up objects using JSON. Now, dealing with JSON in code can be really complicated if you don't have a library that can do the work for you. Luckily in Python there is a JSON library which is built into the Python programming language. So what we have now is we have our import statements, we have our class to define our customers, we have a get customers function for reading our customers from file, we have a get customer function for getting a specific customer, and then we have an update customers function to update and write our customer dictionary back to file. So what we're going to do is let's go ahead and delete this customer data file so we can start from scratch. So we have our dictionary defined in memory, so we want to go ahead and convert our dictionary into JSON format so that we can write it to file. So I'm going to remove this line because we want to convert this dictionary to JSON format. So to use the Python library, what we're going to do is we're going to say import JSON. So I'm going to go ahead and paste that at the top of my script so we can start using the JSON library. And the JSON library allows you to convert dictionaries to JSON using the JSON.dumps function. So we're going to say JSON.dumps, pass in the customer dictionary, and that'll return a JSON data as a string. And then to test that, what we're going to do is we're going to run the print statement and print out that JSON data. Now look what happens when we run this. We actually get an error saying the object of type customer is not JSON serializable. And this is a very important thing to understand. The JSON.dumps function can only work on full dictionary objects. So given this customer is a dictionary of customers, the values is actually of type customer, which is actually a class, not a dictionary. So the JSON.dumps function can only work on full dictionaries. So if we take a look at the difference between our customer class and a dictionary, it will look like this. So instead of having a customer and then using the constructor to fill up that customer object, we would have a dictionary like this. So we would have the key, and then we would have open, close, curly braces, which is how you define a dictionary, and then we would have a bunch of key value pairs. So we have the key as customer ID, the value is H, first name as a key, and then the value, and then last name as a key, and then the value. So this here is what's called a dictionary. This is something we learned in the fundamentals part 1 video. So if we go ahead and convert all our objects to look like a dictionary, the JSON.dumps function will work. But this is not always ideal because a lot of people may prefer to have classes in their application, because having classes has a lot of other functionality and benefits in your application. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove this line, and I'm going to show you how to convert these to dictionaries on the fly. Now a class can be converted to a dictionary on the fly. So to fix our dictionary, we can iterate over it and build a new one. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a new customers dictionary, which is going to be empty, and then I'm going to populate it by looping our dictionary that we have at the top here. So I'm going to use our popular for loop for ID in customers, and then I'm going to create new items in our blank dictionary by saying customer dictionary, open and closing square brackets, and setting an ID. This will create a new item if it doesn't exist, which is going to be the case in our case. Then I say equal, and what I want to do is I want to access the item in our original customers dictionary. So I say customers, open close square brackets, and pass in the ID, and this will obviously return a class that we have defined up here. Now Python classes have a built-in property to convert that class to a dictionary, and to do so all I have to do is say dot underscore underscore dir dict___. This will actually return and convert the dictionary version of our class. And then what I can do to test it, I can actually go ahead and print out that dictionary. So let's comment this out. And when I run this code, we can see now it's converted it to a dictionary. So this is what a dictionary looks like. And then what we can proceed to do is, now that we have a full dictionary, we can use the JSON.dumps function once again, pass in this new dictionary and return it as customer JSON. And to test that, we can run the print function, pass in the JSON. And now if I run it again, this time instead of a dictionary, now we're printing the JSON structure to the screen. Now to explore this, what I can do is say Control N to create a new window. I can say Control Shift P and I can say change language mode and I can select JSON. And I can go ahead and copy the string that we have over here and paste it into this window. Then I can right click and say format document, and this will go ahead and format the document so that we can visualize it. So now we can see we have our full JSON structure written to file. So we have a single JSON object, and inside here we have multiple JSON objects. Firstly, we have the customer ID, which is the key of the dictionary, followed by the actual customer object. So this is what the JSON format looks like. So now we've successfully converted our customer dictionary into JSON, which is good for storage. It's also good for sending it to other services and applications. So we can also use this to store it into a database, a cache, or a file. Now the benefits of doing it this way is that we still have a dictionary we can use for fast processing and simply use JSON just as a storage or transport mechanism. But since our get customers and our update function is still supporting CSV, let's go ahead and upgrade those functions to store the data as JSON and to update the JSON data. So this is very simple. Since I've deleted our customers file, let's start with the update customers function, which is basically writing the customer dictionary to a CSV. And let's change that to write to JSON. So since we're working with JSON, we no longer need this fields dictionary. We can change our with statement to be with customers.json. We use the W keyword to create a file if it doesn't exist. And then we proceed to open the file as usual. Now this is very simple in JSON. We no longer need a CSV writer. We no longer need to write the header row. We also don't need to loop any of the customers. So with the JSON library, it's very simple. All we need to do is say JSON.dumps, pass in the customer dictionary that we get from the function input, and we get the customer string back in JSON format. And then what we do is we just use the customer file.write function to write the JSON to the file. And that's it, just 2 lines. So that's for taking our dictionary, writing it to file. Then we'll also need to change the get customers function, because currently this one is designed to read a CSV and convert it to dictionary. So what we're going to do in this one is we're going to change our file extension to JSON, and then we're going to proceed with an open statement, and we need to rename this to JSON as well. And we're going to open the file as we did before. And this time we're not using the CSV reader, so we can go ahead and remove this line. We also don't need to convert our file to a list, and we don't need to craft a dictionary like we did before. All we have to do in this case is say customer file.read to read the entire file into a variable, and this will read the content into a string. And then once we have that string called data, we're going to want to convert the JSON string into a dictionary. So we looked at converting a dictionary to a string in JSON format. Now we're going to do the opposite, converting a JSON string into a dictionary. And the way we do this is we call the JSON.loads function, and we give it a string, which is going to be the content of our file. And that will return a customer's dictionary, which we can go ahead and return to the caller of the function. So now we've updated our get customers function. We've updated our update customers function. So now we can test our application. So the first thing we're going to do is create that dictionary to hold our customers, and we have our logic to convert our basic dictionary into a full dictionary. So let's go ahead and call the update customers function and pass in that full dictionary to that function. So that'll go ahead and write the JSON file, which we don't have yet. So if I go ahead and run that, we can see it's created our customers.json on the left. I can then go into that file, I can right click, format the document, and we can see that it's written it in JSON format. So our update function works. It's also very easy to add new items to our file by using our class. So I can go ahead and say get customers, get our dictionary back from the JSON file. I can then create a new customer where the ID is called I, and I can then say equals, create a new customer using the customer class. Its customer ID is I, its name is Bob, surname is Smith, and then I can call the internal property to convert it to a dictionary. This will create a customer object, get the dictionary version of it, and assign it to our customer's dictionary, basically adding the customer to our list. And then what we can do is say update customers, and that'll go ahead and write that customer back to the file. So if we go ahead and run that, we can then go to our customer JSON file, right click, format, and we can see our new customer has been written to file successfully. So that is the simple process of converting a dictionary to JSON, writing it to file, and being able to read it from the file and convert it from JSON back to a dictionary for processing. So now that we have our application reading and writing its data to JSON, we effectively removed the state of the application. So now the data of the application no longer lives inside of the application, meaning when we run our application in a container, we can mount the data in. So let's take a look at that by extending our Docker container. Now, so far we only used the first two lines of our Docker file because when we built it, we said Docker build and we pass in the dev target. Now, ideally, when running a container in production, we're not going to be mounting our source code to the container. So this is where Docker multi-stage helps. It helps us do things like development, debugging, as well as produce lightweight runtime images. So I'm going to say from dev as runtime, and then I'm going to copy my source code into the folder in a container called app, and I'm going to define an entry point, and this tells Docker how to run our container. So I'm going to say Python and the path to the application. So to build this container, I'm going to exit out of the container we're in now, and I'm going to say docker build dot, because the location of the Docker file is in this path, and then tag this as customer app. And when I run this will go ahead and build that lightweight container that we can run. And to run the container, it's very simple. All I'm going to do is say docker run -v, and this time I'm mounting the local directory into /work. And notice the reason for mounting the local file system is we want to write the customers.json file. So we want to mount in our local folder, set that as a working directory so that our application will have access to the file on the left here. And before we run that, let's go ahead and delete that file. So I'm just going to delete it, and then I'm going to proceed to run my container. And when it's executed, you can see it created the file on the left again. We can go ahead and format that, and we can see it's written our customers to file. So up to now, we've learned the fundamentals, basics of Python. We've learned how to read and write files. We've learned about CSV data structure, as well as more powerful dynamic JSON data structure. And we've converted our application to be able to read and write its data to JSON and process the data. Now, this allows us to extend our application further. We can store that JSON in a database. We can write it to a cache, to the cloud. We can store it in cloud storage. We can pretty much store it anywhere. We can also use that to build a microservice so other services that want customer data can make a call to our service and retrieve that data. These are the fundamental building blocks of web application development. So next up, we can take a look at how to build a web endpoint so we can serve our data over HTTP. So if you liked the video, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and hit the bell. And if you want to support the channel even further, be sure to hit the link down below to the Patreon or click the join button and become a YouTube member. Also be sure to check out the community link down below. And as always, thanks for watching, and until next time, peace.